Welcome and thank you for being here. Today, I would like to invite you into a different way of seeing illness, through the lens of emotion, energy, and meaning. A case of pulmonary hypertension will be our doorway. An elderly patient presents with elevated right heart pressure, day and night sweats and weight loss, 10 kilograms over 6 months. In the question of hematological disease such as lymphoma, his peripheral blood smear is normal, with no gross enlarged lymph nodes in his chest or abdomen. Structurally, everything looks fine. Nothing explained his symptoms clearly. In Western terms, this might be labeled idiopathic, smoldering tuberculosis without cough or other signs of pneumonia. We are missing the most important data in the patient's story. The patient had recently lost his wife. Since then, night sweats, digestive issues, emotional flatness. Not just sadness, grief frozen in the body. This is shingles, and its anatomical location is important. In Chinese medicine, these are the meridians coming out from bladder 21 and 23 points, indicating weakness in the stomach and spleen. But why there? In Western medicine, we call it local immune weakness. But what if this is due to weakness of the stomach and spleen from recent undigested personal loss? Emotions don't vanish. Unexpressed grief moves inward and upward, weakening the stomach and lungs. Poor appetite and perhaps latent tuberculosis came out. What if this is another example for Besham's terrain theory? Not blaming the virus, but pointing towards the local body weakness instead. We often think of Takotsubo as a heart that breaks. Here, we see it functionally. A man whose left ventricular ejection fraction dropped from 60 to 30% just over a couple of months without ischemia, but with overwhelming unprocessed loss. The myocardium, like the lung, responds to emotional trauma with stunning. What we are seeing here is not just physiology, it is biography made visible. The patient had experienced a profound personal loss that was never fully processed. There were no tears, no words, no rituals. Just a quiet internal collapse. And the body began to speak in its own language. The sweating were emotional overflow, a kind of weeping the body does when the heart cannot. The loss of appetite was not just a metabolic symptom. It reflected something deeper, an inability to digest what had happened. In traditional systems, the stomach and spleen are where we process life experience. And when trauma is too dense, digestion gets overwhelmed. And the lungs, the organs of breath, rhythm, and release, began to bear the load. Not with shortness of breath or wheezing, but with subtle constriction, a pressure from inside, as though grief had nowhere to go but inward. Before tuberculosis became a public health concern, it was something else, something haunting, beautiful, and tragic. Here comes Bechamp again. What is the emotional background of tuberculosis? In the 19th century, tuberculosis was called the romantic disease. Not because it was desirable, but because of how it manifested. Pale skin, flushed cheeks, fevered eyes, emotional intensity. It was associated with artists, poets, and dreamers. Jews who felt too much, too deeply, with weak personal boundaries. Writers like John Keats, composers like Chopin, and characters in operas and novels, all struck by this slow wasting illness. In those days, tuberculosis was not just seen as an infection. It was viewed as a physical expression of exquisite sensitivity, of souls that could not fully live in this world. Tuberculosis was melancholy made visible. A soft collapse of the self, a long exhale of unspoken sorrow shown in the positive quantiferon test. A latent tuberculosis, a silent sleeper in the lungs. The body remembers, sometimes through the breath. As discussed above, in cardiology we now recognize a condition called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, also known as broken heart syndrome. But what if grief can also constrict the lungs as well as the heart? Just as the left ventricle may balloon and fail under the emotional weight loss, perhaps the pulmonary circuit, more hidden, more silent, bears the pressure in its own way. In this patient, we see minimal structural lung disease. Yet, right ventricular pressure is elevated. There is tension, but no cause we can find, unless we look at the story behind. This is what I propose we call a Takotsubo lung with a Takotsubo heart. A pulmonary hypertension not due to fibrosis or hypoxia, but to stagnation, to loss that was never metabolized, to grief that remained suspended in the chest, pressing inward, tightening the capillary field. This is not clotting, it is sludging, blood that has lost rhythm and responsiveness and became dense. Energetically, it mirrors unresolved emotion stuck in life. Please see a separate video about blood sludging and blood stasis and its significance. If the cause is emotional, the treatment must also be similar. We don't just push fluid, we move emotions. Of course, this emotional clearance must be supported with herbs. Interestingly, a recent echocardiogram showed his ejection fraction dropped to just 30% over 6 months. There were 2 separate scans 6 months ago confirming a normal ejection fraction. The patient's clinical condition reflected this change. With his wife's death, he became sad, overwhelmed, and more tired. No infarction, no recent ischemia, just grief left unprocessed. The evidence is not emotional. It is hemodynamic. We are not machines. We are stories, encoded in breath, blood, and memory. And sometimes they whisper it in pressure. Nomadic field medicine where structure meets spirit.